Okay, everyone. So welcome to the next edition of the vRetreat. Last one was Virtual 2, and some familiar faces in here. And as you can see, we've also got Cohesity on the call, who are quarterbacking the entire event today. We've got Chris Colotti, Michael Letchen, and Teresa Miller on board here. And they're going to tell you a bit more about Cohesity. So I'm going to throw this over to Chris to start off, and we'll move on from there. We'll have a 15-minute break after Chris is done, and then we'll continue. Teresa will be up after that.
All right. You got to actually let me share my screen. If you want to make me co-host.
Yes, I can. I know you will. Yeah, it just says make host. It doesn't give me the option to make co-host. So
yeah, there you go. That. Now I can share. All right. Oop, I gotta go. All right, so I'm gonna go through a couple of things about just some high-level stuff about Cohesity. I think most of you guys are familiar with the history. The messaging's changed a little bit, so a little bit of slideware, not a ton. And then what I'm gonna actually do is everybody who's on this call should have got invited by Mike last week to actually grab a copy of the VE, the virtual edition. There's multiple editions you can download in the download site. You should have gotten invited to the support site. And then, Mike, did you actually send out the quick start guides yet?
I sent it yesterday to the list of people I had. Some of you might not have got the invite until yesterday morning. I realized I missed a step on some of you guys and fixed it yesterday morning.
Not a problem. So for those who did get it, we're going to actually do a little bit of a guided walkthrough. So if you did get the VE deployed and get it to a point where, you can actually access the UI and you've bypassed all of the, you've gotten past the EULA and all that other stuff, I will actually cover the quick part of the setup after you deploy it. But all the stuff is in the quick start guide. It makes it a lot easier. And then what we're going to do is just kind of look at some of the sources. We're going to connect it to some stuff in our lab. We'll do some basic virtual machine functions. And then after the break, Teresa's actually going to go a little bit deeper into some use case specific stuff. So we want to give you a little bit of a high level VMware specific and then real deep dive use case stuff with Teresa. So if you have questions, just interrupt as you go. Most of you guys know me. I'm pretty laid back, and either myself or Teresa or Mike will jump in and answer a question. So again, most of you are fairly familiar with Cohesity. Not much has changed in the last year, other than we've all been stuck at home. A couple new investors that came around with the last round with Google Ventures and Morgan Stanley. But most of you know it was founded by Mohit in 2013. He also founded Nutanix. He was a lead on the Google file system. So there's a lot of talent inside the company that comes from all around the industry, both Google and other storage companies. We all know this is a pretty incestuous business, so people have moved around quite a bit. I'm not going to go through the full-on messaging that we do. We wanted to slim this down, but to give you a high level, the vision for Mohit is to manage customer data like Google manages consumer data. So we all know that, Google built their own file system. They actually allow users to manage all that stuff, and then they push it out to the end user. Well, what we wanted, and it's all in one platform. So what our vision is to build on the platform that's powered by SpanFS as a single platform for multiple workloads. And we'll get into some of the things you can do from an app tier and things like that. We also layer on all of the management. So there's one thing you won't have access to with the VE is Helios, which is the SaaS-based single pane of glass that you can manage multiple clusters with. And that's primarily because it's really hard to give, all of you guys access to your own Helios. It's intended to be a managed environment where, multiple people at the same company can access multiple clusters. We use it ourselves, and I can show you what it looks like from our view, but it's really hard for us to give that as part of the license. And then on top of that, we actually have the Cohesity marketplace, which runs all the apps and services. So everything we do now essentially runs as an app. They have different names like Data Protect. There's iManus, which isn't even iManus now since we bought it. This slide actually is not that old, but already has to be updated. We can run Splunk. We can run antivirus. We can run a number of different things on top of the same platform against the data that's been backed up. So that actually came out sometime last year. You probably saw that at one of the Cloud Field days. We don't go too deep into SpanFS, but this is a logical architecture of what the platform looks like once you've loaded the operating system or what's on a VE. Under the covers is SpanFS. This is what Mohit and the engineers developed from the ground up. The key component to this that we're gonna see a lot today is sort of under the Snaptree umbrella. And I'll show you what an empty Snaptree looks like, and I'll actually flip over to one that's been running for a long time, so you can see how far back some of the backups go. But essentially, everything lives under the covers with all the cluster management, data journaling, the repositories, and on top of that, we actually have the API layer. So this is what John does a lot of work on. So John Hildebrand, for you guys who know him, he's working a lot with the SDK and the APIs with things like VRA, VRO, PowerShell. All of that is available to anybody to code against. So you can actually write some of your own PowerShell scripts to actually do backups, to do restores, to automate some things. We also expose the data over different protocols. Today, the protocols are either NFS, SMB, or S3. So it's one of the things that kind of gets lost around the platform is it's not just a data backup device, right? It's a file system. It's a filer. We have a lot of customers who actually use it for NFS. You're starting to see a lot of stuff if you follow our blog posts and things like that around what we call smart files. Smart files is essentially the file system component that we are selling as a filer. Yes, we still have spinning disk. We still have a flash tier, so it's not considered a place where you want to run tier 1 VMs and things like that, but it is where customers are doing basic file shares for user data, documents, things like that, because we can also back them up onto the same platform and then replicate them around. We do have direct connectivity into cloud, different cloud components. And again, these are the names of the features, but cloud tier is our ability to scale the file system out into an S3 or other cloud bucket functionality. So we'll actually move the cold data out to cloud and then bring it back if it's needed. Cloud archive is simply the ability to take backups and take a copy of it, keep it locally, and then send an archive copy out to a cloud bucket for 365 days or 7 years or however long you want to keep it. Cloud spin is something we won't, you might have seen some videos on. It's our ability to actually take a Windows VM take a VM running in vSphere and actually spin it up to AWS or Azure. So we can actually do the translation and conversion in the process, and then you can have that VM running. Teresa's got a couple videos out there on cloud spin AWS that I believe is on the YouTube channel. Outside of that is all of the applications, which we actually run them in a containerized fashion. So if a third-party developer like Splunk or ClamAV wants to run their application, we actually will spin it up in a container model. So we do have a form of Kubernetes running under the covers. So all of those things will run in containerized fashion so that we can stretch them across the multiple nodes that are built into a cluster. So a typical cluster is 3 to 4 nodes, but we've got ones that go as big as 60 nodes right now with some of our largest customers. So the VE is obviously a single node, so there's no distributed file system within the VE. Although there is, if you get into the download site, there's a robo version, and there's also a clustered version. You can install the clustered version and actually experiment with the multiple nodes if you wanted to. So what I wanted to cover for the first half was specifically how we do hypervisor data protection. So we are going to talk about the data protect component more than the file sharing and file system pieces of it. And we're going to focus on VMware, but we do have integration with Hyper-V, AHV, and RHV. VMware is probably our tightest integration, obviously, because that's our bulk of our customer base from a virtualization backup component. But we'll talk through how we do things a little bit differently and some of the things that that give you some advantage from a test dev perspective, from a developer perspective, and things like that. We also cover SQL and databases and all that other stuff, but obviously can't do all that in 2 hours. So the first thing I wanted to do is actually talk. We get this question a lot from vSphere guys or folks that know vSphere quite a bit. All right, what's the backup and restore process look like? From a logical perspective. So we'll walk through this, and if you have questions, let me know. There's some nuances behind the scenes that that John and I talk about a lot from a networking perspective and kernel perspectives and all the things that we know about vCenter and vSphere. The first thing that we do, and actually this comes up a lot when we're troubleshooting. Mike and I know this from an actual customer. So as an anecdote, we'll sometimes get involved in calls where, you know, somebody says, hey, you guys are slowing down our vCenter or our host. And, you know, we have to explain to them with this diagram, you know, what we're doing. And we're like, we're not hitting your vCenter other than for an API call. So true story. We can get into that offline. But the first thing we'll do is when a data protect job starts, we'll make an API call to Virtual Center to basically find out where the VMs are. So we'll take a native snapshot within VMware. So we'll put it into snapshot mode. If you've enabled the functionality, we'll use VSS as an option. That's step one, right? So API call, take a snapshot. Once we've actually taken a vSphere snapshot, we do NBD transport over 902 using the node IPs of the cluster. So what we basically get from vCenter is, this is the VM I want to back up. What host is it on? So we pick up that host name, and then we start to stream the data to all the nodes in the cluster from that host. This is where the networking stuff comes in that I don't want to get into a rat hole, but just think in your mind, depending on the host configuration, we're getting host name via DNS, and I'll leave it at that. There's some backend configuration stuff that's really important to make sure you optimize the network traffic over NBD. Once we've actually streamed the data, and that's the other reason, is we're streaming it to all all nodes in a Cohesity cluster. So it's very high performing, which means we're just sucking data down from all the different hosts. Now, if we're backing up, 30 or 40 or 100 VMs, and those VMs live across 20 or 30 hosts, we're streaming all that data from those different hosts simultaneously to all the nodes. Pretty simple. And then actually what we do is we'll release the snapshot. That's the one step that's not in here, but when the backup is completed, we release the snapshot. So depending on the size of the VM, there can be, do we have storage integration to deal with stun issues and things like that? It's rarely a problem unless the VM is a very heavy utilized data change rate type VM, like a file server or a media server, things like that, where there's constant changes happening during the backup. What this does is, once we've got the backup, before I talk about the restore, and then we'll go into the demo, is it provides us a full catalog of backups. So one of the things that we do that's differently, if you've never seen this slide, is we'll take that first backup throughout that process. So it's the first time we've backed up that virtual machine, we take a full backup, we stick it on the data platform. We stick it on the file system. When we run subsequent backups, whether it's daily, hourly, monthly, whatever we're doing, the first thing we'll do on the platform is take a zero-cost clone of the first full backup. We'll then do the incremental, and this is where it changes a little bit. What we do is we apply the incremental to that zero-cost clone. So if you were to look at this as a catalog, we actually have 2 fully hydrated images that we can restore from for any purpose we want, whether it's for disaster purposes, whether it's for development purposes, whether it's for testing purposes. As this catalog grows, we can instantly restore any version of that VM without doing the restoration of the original, then applying incrementals. Every single one of these becomes a full catalog. So it's a really good development tool as well. The next thing we'll do on the next run is we'll take another zero-cost clone of that second version. We'll take the next incremental, we'll apply it, and we'll rinse and repeat. So this ends up being, now we've got 3 fully hydrated images in the catalog we can choose from if we wanted to do a recovery for any reason or a test dev recovery. What we then do is, when we want to actually do instant recoveries, we can actually pick any one of those at any point in time and restore at near zero RTOs up to thousands of virtual machines. Because when we'll see the way we do it, I'll switch environments after we get the basic one stood up, so we can actually see what restoring 10 of them looks like live, or 20 of them looks like live. But we'll actually restore it and then continue the operation so the customer can actually work on the VM as they're coming up. So they're actually available instantly within a few seconds. So how does that recovery process actually work, and what does it look like? Well, what we do, we make another API call back to Virtual Center to essentially mount a data store. So the first thing we do is we're going to mount an NFS data store to the Cohesity data platform as a file share. So we're using NFS protocol, and from there is where we'll actually do all of the work. So the first thing we do once we've mounted that is we'll clone the Cohesity side to what we call an internal view. Don't get wrapped around the terminology. It's a file share. We just call it a view. And we'll find that VMDK and then present it to the host as a data store. So we'll basically say, here's that virtual machine we want to restore. We've cloned a copy of it over. mount it with NFS, and present it to the host that we want to restore it to. So if you actually look in Virtual Center, you'll see a new data store pop into the inventory, and we'll see that when we do the restore. What we then do is we actually restore the virtual machine into the inventory from that file share. We actually say, we register it. We say, here's the VM, here's the one we want, let's power it on, if we've elected to power it on or not. Most people will actually do the power on sequence. So now you've got a data store mounted from our file system, a VM that's been brought into inventory, we've powered it on, and it's still running on our file system. What we then do is we'll issue a storage vMotion API call to say, move that VM from this file share that we've presented over to where we want it to live permanently. So through the restore process, you could say, put it on its original location, or you could say, put it on this data store. You could say, put it on the Pure if it was backed up from a Nimble, but you want to restore it to the Pure. It doesn't matter. We'll do the storage vMotion wherever you tell us to go. This is typically the longest part of the process when we're doing multiples. Like if you're doing 30, 40, 50, we've done this at scale at VMworld for 60 and 100 VMs. You could sit there and watch the whole process. Ultimately, the storage vMotion is the part that takes the longest. The VMs will be available within about 5 or 10 minutes, and it just sequences through them. What we then do is we'll clean up the data store. So when it's all said and done, the data store doesn't live very long. So that if a storage administrator goes in there, they don't, they'll see it come in during a restore, and they'll see it go away when it's all done. There is a process that we have for test dev where we'll actually keep the data store, and you can run that VM, for testing and development purposes without ever doing the storage vMotion. So it shortens the process, but it also means that it's not permanently sitting there. This is the full restore. Like you get hit with ransomware, you got to do a full recovery, anything like that. We would actually present it and then remove it. Questions so far?
Again, it sounds really simple. Does the GUID change when you do the restore? Just if you're using some kind of automation agents?
That's a great question. So when you set up your backup job, when you get to play with it, there is actually an option to preserve it during the backup. Okay. So it's actually set at the time you do the backup policy.
That's fine.
That makes sense.
It's just thinking of things like, VCF or Terraform or stuff like that. They get really twitchy when you do a restore and go, oh, that VM's not there anymore. I don't know what to do.
Yes. So what we see customers do is depending on virtual machine, depending on the use of the VM, they'll run different backup policies with different settings like that, for example, where they want to maintain the UUID versus, we just need a copy of it. We don't care if the UUID changes because it's not connected to something else.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yep. You also have options to connect the network or not connect the network. There's a whole, we'll see it when we do the restore path. So how does this actually change versus some of the legacy stuff? The biggest thing is first time to user input, if that makes sense. So if we're putting it in terms of websites, first time to byte, but first time to user interaction. Well, in a legacy restore, you've got to initiate it. You've got to wait for that to actually complete. So you've got to rehydrate the machine. You've then got to restore the data to this target device that you want it to go to. Then the user access is restored, right? Towards the end of the process. We flip the script on that. We do it the opposite way. We initiate the restore, we give user access initially, and then we actually do the data recovery and the storage vMotion and all the movement after they've already got access to it. So from a Cohesity perspective, we significantly reduce the time to first user interaction, is the way I put it, which is most important to most customers, right? We've all been there where you're waiting for the VM to restore and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting until you can actually do anything with it, yet the application's still down and it's been down for X amount of hours or minutes. This allows us to get applications back online, interact with it, make any changes to it, check it, and then put it back into production immediately. And all the while, the other stuff's still happening on the back end, moving it back to its original data store, because we don't care about that. We just need it to get done, but we don't need it to be done first. So let me jump over to my view environment where I've actually got these in two different states. So I'm going to do a little bit of an easy bake oven scenario. So I've got this one here. This first Cohesity cluster is after you've deployed it, after you've attached some disks to it and gone through part of the quick start guide, but you haven't configured the cluster yet, because I just want you to see how easy it is to configure the cluster services within the VE. So it's two stages. You deploy the VE. It has a basic environment on it where we actually have to set up the cluster services, format the disks, and all that other stuff, and then it flips to where you can actually integrate with the UI. So this is this is the very first step after it's been deployed, and you need to configure it. So essentially what we're going to do is you fill in all the basics of the cluster settings that you're going to want to use. In this case, when you look at the quick start guide, it's a little weird with the VE. We still call it a cluster, but it's a single node cluster. And you have to essentially create all of these different, you just put in your basic subnet, your subnet mask, and your single node IP. If you're doing the cluster version of it, you would have multiples and you'd have some VIPs and things like that. Essentially, once you've filled all this in and you go to create the cluster, it's going to kick off the process. This process can take, we're not going to watch it happen. It's going to go to the point where you'll get this screen. So it's very, very simple. And that's the whole point I wanted to set that up for, was it's one screen worth of settings. Everything happens, and now you can access the cluster and move forward. Now, when we get to it, after it's been deployed and been formatted, we'll basically get the first screen, which is your end user agreement. And for what's changed with the latest version is we don't actually need a license key. And I wanted to show this, even though it's in the quick start guide, but we can actually deploy this with license management through Helios, or we can deploy it through on-prem as a single managed entity, which you'll see this in the quick start guide. We point out you want to pick this, this local one. And we're going to manually license it, because you actually get a trial license, or not a trial license, but a nag license that will start nagging you after 30 or 60 days. I can't remember what the time period is. And you can actually skip all of this. But if you were actually a real customer, you can license it. You got your cluster ID. You can submit your license key. But for most of you guys, you're just going to skip it. And that's it. This is now set up and ready to go and start connecting to sources. I'm actually going to switch to dark mode because I think it's a little bit easier to see. Which one's easier on the Zoom? Is that one better, or is the white one? Dark. Okay. Yeah, I thought so. So this is now a pristine, empty VE with no data on it. And the reason I wanted to do this is because if you haven't seen our workflows, this is one of the things that impressed me the most when you actually walk through it. Is right in the middle of this, you've got your very first button, which says Start Data Protection. You could go through all these menus and you can do a whole bunch of stuff, but at the very least, you can start here. And when you fire up this button, it gives you all of the sources that you can connect to. Now, these have submenus. So when we say virtual server, we can then pick a source, right? So now our sources would be here, but obviously this is brand new. So we can actually, within the same workflow, register a new source. And here I'm going to actually register a virtual center, which is vcs1.vcity.xyz. My username. But I haven't left. When we go through this, you'll notice I haven't actually left the backup workflow. This is just in a branch off of the same workflow. So this way you could see the UUIDs to track virtual machines. Actually, it's at the source level. So I think once you turn it on, it's on. I do believe I have the right vCenter. Make sure. Yeah, I do. So once we connect to the virtual center, now we're back into that context. So I've actually attached the source, but now it brings me back to where I was, which is where now I can see all of the virtual machines. This is where we do some really cool stuff. We can search for anything that has desktop, or if I could spell, in the inventory. And we're going to actually pull through all of the VMs that have desktop in the name. We could pull through anything that has SQL in the name. And this is a global search, essentially. You'll also notice it presents the same virtual center structure, but we can also look at folder hierarchy and do the same search. We can do the straight up VM listing. So if you're searching by VMs, some people like this view so that, hey, I just want to get, I just want to see my desktops. Or we actually support tags. And if the tags are configured inside vCenter, we actually present the tags through to the person setting up the job. So this is the very first step, is we got to pick our source or create our source and then grab the virtual machines we want to back up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go here and I'm going to search for, I don't think these are in a job. So I'll just grab a couple of these because I've got to do some nimble integration testing later this week. You can pick the virtual machines you want, or in some cases with the folder listing or tags, we do what's called an auto protect. So if you wanted to auto protect an entire folder, you can actually click this shield with an A on it. What that will do for tags, folders, or hierarchy, it will say anything that's within this folder or has this tag, just start protecting it. So tags for service providers are huge. Tags for regular customers are huge because they could say, hey, these are all of our tags. These are our backup jobs based on tags. And every time a new VM gets deployed via automation, it gets a certain tag on it. It automatically gets picked up in our backup job. They never have to go to the backup side to add it. So the auto protect feature is really useful for a lot of customers. But I'm just going to go back here and pick these two virtual machines, and I'm going to save that. Now, the next step is I got to give it a group name, and I got to give it a policy. But I don't have anything but my gold, silver, bronze policies. But same as the source, I could actually create a new policy right in line in the process if I wanted to. So I can just say that this is my new policy. And here is where I can add things like Cloud Archive. I'm not going to go through this, but you'd have to add an external target. But if you don't have an external target, you can branch out of this workflow again to create the external target. So we've never had to go back and forth through screens. We're actually doing it for you, which makes it really useful. You can add blackout dates. You can add replication. You can do logs. You can do bare metal recoveries. So you have all these different options that you can add to it. But let's say, well, I don't actually want to, I'm going to save this one with this basic setting, but I've decided I want to actually go and use my gold backup or my gold policy. And you can see that policy is already set for retain for 3 months. And every month do another backup and retain it for, 1,096 days. Most people don't use the defaults, but now,
Chris,
yes.
Just a quick question. When you're selecting your objects there, you can use tags to auto protect and whatever.
Yes.
Can you exclude anything with tags?
Yes.
So you can have a tag saying don't back me up or something.
Yeah, let me show you that in a different cluster because I actually have some exclusions. But yes, there is you could do an auto protect, and then within that auto protect, go pick a specific VM and say exclude this one.
Could you also exclude on a tag or?
I'd have to go double check that. I don't think so. I think you include by tag and then exclude individuals.
Okay.
But that's a good question. We can take that one back. Mike, can you make note of that one? Because I know what he's asking. Can we actually say grab all of these tags? So you're saying if something's double tagged or has more than one tag?
Environment I've got at the moment, I've got a tag saying finance system.
Yep.
Anyway, I want to back up everything with that tag like this, except for I've got these two test and dev VMs I've just spun up to practice with that have got an additional tag called no backup. Gotcha.
So it's still tagged as finance, but it has another tag.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it could be everything in that folder, but except for the ones with this tag sort of thing.
Yeah. Let me take that one offline. That's actually a really good question.
Yeah, I was gonna say that does sound quite cool.
Yeah. No, let me. If it's not there, we have some resources we can go to bounce it off of to see how we can.
I'm pretty sure it's not there.
I'm pretty sure it's not either, but
Yeah,
we can present the use case. It's definitely that's an interesting use case, Mike.
Yeah, very logical as to why you would want that. But I'm pretty sure right now it's not a if then.
You have to manually. Yeah, you'd almost have to manually remove those.
Those two, you'd have to find them by
two.
name. Yeah, but you could do the search by name, but we'll take that one offline and see what we can do with it. From a storage domain perspective, when you deploy a new cluster, a default storage domain is created. This is just a way to take the file system and carve it up into other silos. For example, this is very useful in a multi-tenant service provider environment where each tenant will have a separate storage domain within the cluster. And each storage domain can have its own dedupe and compression algorithms. So depending on what the customer is paying for or that tenant is paying for, most times, most out-of-the-box deployments, everybody just uses the single storage domain. It's really more used in a service provider environment. So we'll actually pick the default that was already created for us when this was deployed. And then we can set any additional settings, right? We're still just setting up that first backup job, but now we've never left this screen, but we've selected our source, we've selected our VMs, we've created a policy and selected it, and we've got all of our additional all of our additional options that we want, like whether we want to have storage level protection. So if we actually had integrated, a Nimble or a Pure, we could do that. Once we go ahead and protect this, it's going to kick off the job. So we're going to see, with any luck, there is my two Nimble snapshots that just got created. I have to try to catch it pretty quick. And those are the two that I selected. And the reason I used my ID was because it was going to be easier to find. You notice this is a production vCenter, so we're actually using service accounts generally. So there's a whole bunch of backups going on. And when the backup is done, it will actually release the snapshot. And if we want to actually look at that, we can go to data protection. And now we can see that job, and we can see, we can watch it run. Now this one's going to take longer because it's the first initial backup that's running. So it's going to do a full backup. And because we're in a virtual environment, because of the way I've deployed this, it's not fully optimized networking and things like that. Like there's some things you can do with a VE to make sure that it's on an optimized network. So this one's just going to take a little bit longer. But you can see here, everything I talked about is in the logs. We go say, where's this VM? It's located on host 5. Let's start streaming the data off of host 5. I'll make the comment once more. We do everything via DNS. So we're going to pick up the DNS name of the VM, and that's the network we're going to stream it off of. Question so far, and then I'll switch over to an environment that's got a lot more stuff running.
Chris, I know it sounds a really simple one, but for guys just getting started with the VE edition, is there any kind of recommended specs, like using SSDs or Synologies, or where's best to kind of get our best bang for buck to get the best experience on this?
With the VEs, so there's there's 3 disks that get deployed. So I'll kind of answer it a little sideways. The first disk in the OVA is the operating system. When you look at the quick start guide, you've got to add a meta disk and you've got to add a data disk. We have actually experimented in our environment. We've actually got one VE that has its meta tier on SSD running on a Pure, and its data tier running on a Nimble hybrid. So we've actually put the bulk storage on a slower array with the virtual disk sitting there, and then the meta tier, which is normally where we would have SSD in the physical. So actually, if you take the physical cluster, you've got your operating system and your operating system running on the spinning disks, your data tier running on the spinning disks, and your meta tier running in SSD and NVMe. So you can mimic that with a VE. And you kind of have to see the quick start guide, because before you can power it on, you've got to add 2 disks. You've basically got to add the meta disk and the data disk.
That's more what I was kind of reading through and just thinking, where's the best way? The data for me would be best on my Synology on NFS and out the way, and I've got loads of storage and.
Yep.
But then I can aim, as you said, the metadata on my NVMEs or stuff like that.
And the OVAs themselves, you'll see there's different sizes. When you go to deploy it, there's a small and a large. They take up different CPUs. For you guys running them in home labs, when they are deployed, it's deployed like a virtual center OVA, where it has some per virtual machine reservations. So be aware of that. So like we always, if we got a customer who wants to deploy a lot of these and they want to deploy them large, I think the large one is 8 or 16 CPUs and like 64 gigs of RAM. There's reservations set on that. So my first question is always, do you have isolation, or do you have HA admission control turned on? And how much resources do you have in your clusters on all your different hosts? Because you might be able to power 2 or 3 on, but if you get to 4, 5, and 6, they may not come on because of the reservations. It's one of those little nuances that's been around forever, but I make people aware of it that the OVA's got a reservation on.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. So this cluster here, this is a much bigger cluster. So this is an 8. So we've gone from, nothing running to one source to this particular cluster, which has, I believe, a dozen or so sources on it. This is a physical 8-node cluster. So here you could see we're actually doing VMware, Microsoft SQL, physical servers, Active Directory. So Active Directory is in the version you guys can get is 6.5, which is what this is running. That'll give you the dark mode and the Active Directory stuff and some other pieces and parts. And 6.5.1 will be available in the next few weeks. Azure, Isilon, different NAS objects. We've got the Nimbles integrated, the Pure integrated. So these are all basically nothing but different sources in that source list. All we saw when we did the initial one was that very first VMware one. So whatever you guys have in your labs that you want to play with, there's probably a source for it. If you have an Azure account or you have an AWS account, you can connect to those as well. Office 365, that'll all be some stuff that Teresa goes deeper into. But what I wanted to do is cover a recovery so you can see what it looks like and, sort of at scale in the virtual center side of things. So since we're doing multiple backups here, what I want to actually show is a long snap tree. So we're going to restore a VM. We're going to look for, do I actually have these in here? Maybe I do. I don't remember if I have them backed up or not. Nope, I think I killed that job. So I'm just going to search for desktops because there's a whole bunch of these here. So there's a job right here that we have running all the time called static desktops. And you can tell that it's auto protected because it's got a full protection group on it. And these are all the VMs that are in it. Now, all right, so the dark mode needs to get tweaked a little bit. We've already told them because when you highlight that, you can't see anything until you click on it. But this is the snap tree for this job. So this is the catalog. So this catalog goes from yesterday all the way back to May 5th, right? Because of our retention policy. I think we've set our retention policy to about 90 days. So at any one of these given points in time, we could pick and say, let's go ahead and restore this entire list of VMs. So I'm just going to pick June 22nd because it's just random. And within June 22nd, I'll see the desktops that were there. And then I can go ahead and check that box and say, yep, I want to go ahead and restore that one. So I want to continue this. Then it'll show that the last backup was July 8th, but you'll notice it kept the June 22nd that I picked. So you can either choose it there or you can choose it here and see the same list. But I'm basically picking a random point in time to prove a point that these were backed up last month. They'll still all become available within minutes. What we always do when we do demos is we always just pick a different location. So for example, and we were working on this, it got delayed, but we were going to stand up a second virtual center and another data center. We could register that source in this cluster and say, oh, take the VMs that were backed up from VCSA 01 in San Jose and restore that VM over to Santa Clara in a different virtual center, right? So not a full DR in scenario, but it's good for test and dev or other purposes. But it's all in how many sources are registered. We just only happen to have the one source registered. I am going to pick a final data store location for this to go on to. I'll use this one. Looks like it's got enough free space. And I'm going to just pick a specific folder because it's easiest to find. If you don't go through all of this stuff, and you do restore to original location, it's going to put it back in the same folder, the same resources, and the same virtual center. We always put a prefix on here for demo so I can find it in the inventory. This is where you can attach a network or detach a network or leave them powered off. I always like them to power on because I want people to see that part of the process. So this is all that's required for the recovery. And this can be done through automations and the APIs as well. So everything you see in the UI can be done through the API. So the first thing I'm going to do is jump over here and see if I can catch it. This data store was just created. Should have been on that screen before it started. And the reason I know that is because it doesn't have any VMs in it. But what you're going to see is you're going to start seeing VMs populate into that data store. So that was that first step of the process where we're actually presenting that. And we can kind of prove it under the covers because when you look at the configuration of this and you look at the device backing, you can see that the server that's running off of is COH02. It's a different VLAN, so we're not getting into all the networking nuances, but we've actually mapped that to an iSCSI VLAN. So we're not connecting to the management interface of the Cohesity. We've actually got a different VLAN on the 10 gig side that we force it to. There's a lot of stuff John and I have documented around this from when we built the environment, and now it's all in some of the best practices. But this is our Cohesity cluster. Actually, I can prove it by going over here and going over to networking and show you that VLAN is this one right here. So it's actually mounting it on that 30 network, which is non-routable. I'll just leave some of those nuances in your brain because this is all sort of networking VMware best practices, right? We're not routing the traffic to that data store. We're presenting that data store like any other NFS data store on a non-routable VLAN. Once all of these VMs are brought in, as they're brought in, so they're brought in sequence. You know, first VM gets brought in, but then it's powered on. Next VM gets brought in, then it's powered on. Next VM gets brought in, it's powered on. This is where I was saying that these are running on our storage, but these, you can interact with these. These are fully operational and ready to interact with. And you can, if they had network, we could actually, you know, our RDP to them. We could do a whole bunch of stuff and interact with it. But I can actually work on this VM. I don't know that I know the password to this one, but let's try one. Just for giggles. Nope, not right. What, that one? No, maybe. Possibly. Could be the right one. But once they're all done, once they've all been powered on, then we actually start the storage vMotion process. So it's very sequential, right? Because we don't want to overload the vSphere APIs. We don't want to overload we work within the limits of the API calls. But the storage vMotion is why I say it always takes the longest, because we can't control that. It's still a little bit slow and archaic, and it's just the way the technology works. We do have continuous data protection options and things like that for the protection piece, but when we do the restores, that piece is just in VMware's control. But we do kick it off, right, so that the user doesn't have to worry about it. As far as a VI admin is concerned, he can start working on these, and a storage vMotion is going to start when it's all done.
Is there any way of controlling the order that they sequentially arrive in, other than saying restore this one, then restore this one?
Not that I've actually seen. Mike, have you seen anything? Or Teresa, when I do a big job like this, it just starts, I don't even know which one it started with. It's now on 11. I'm trying to see if there's an order. It did 13, then it did 11. It's always seemed to be just
I don't know the algorithm
in that job.
It seems random on the numbering to me. I don't think there's, I do think though, will it do the power? It'll follow VMware's like power on cycles. If you've got something already set, I think, if you have it on the power on, but I don't think there's any algorithm for which ones get restored faster.
So I'm guessing your
I
use
don't think
case,
so either.
Yeah, and the reason for the question, and I'm taking a guess, is the use cases I've got, 50 VMs in my tier 1 bucket of backups, but I want, obviously the AD servers to come up first, or I want, database servers to come up first, right? Is that
that sort of big scale DR event?
Yeah, it's it may not be in that one mass job, but Mike, take a note of that one. That's something we can experiment with in the lab as well. It might be creative policy creation, if that makes sense. So
what I would do in that is set them not to power on, and then go through and let VMware do the power on sequence. Okay. Or set so some are powering on. We don't do it natively, but just where Chris told them all to power on. Obviously, if you need your ADs or domain controllers first, just set your restore job to not power on first.
Right, and then just go power.
Let them get over, and then just go over to vCenter and turn them on. I mean, honestly, it's probably more efficient anyway.
So just to add to that too, I mean, we've got the runbook, the DR runbook orchestration is supposed to control that for a disaster recovery. And the most recent version that's coming out will do VMware to VMware. So I think it's really going to depend on your scenario. Like if you're trying to recover back to your original location because everything is online there, then what Chris and Mike just suggested would probably be the right approach. But if you're going to another location with that data, you may want to leverage that runbook orchestration, which we wouldn't have the ability to probably do today. I don't think we'd have the time.
Yeah, that's because that's based out of the App Store. That's not something that you guys.
I will put a note though, so that it follows the rest of our.
We can. Yeah, you could script as this is all API controllable. We could have our own recovery script that fires this off and says, pull back my AD controllers, turn them on, wait for them to arrive before turning on.
Yeah, I would say that's a workflow question, right? So. There's a couple. So what we did is we used the built-in recovery workflow, if that makes sense, right? So we picked a job, we picked VMs, and we said restore these. To Mike's point, if you don't power them on, the restores will happen faster. They literally just pop into the inventory, but that power on call creates a delay. So it registers, waits, powers on, waits, registers, waits, powers on, waits. If you take that wait out, to your point, because this is all API driven, you could use PowerShell to go into a job. So let's say the backup job, we're brainstorming here, right? We could have John work on this. You could go into a single backup job that's got 50 VMs in it. And you could say, I want to restore just these 2 first, right? And I want to restore those and power those on. Then I want to access that same backup job, that same point in time, and grab these 4 virtual machines and then power those on. To Teresa's point, it's not a policy issue. It's not a backup job issue. It is a limitation in the built-in recovery workflow, if that makes sense. Because the built-in recovery workflow says just grab these VMs and just restore them. But because it's all API driven, to your point, you could get a little more creative.
Thank you.
But definitely a good note to maybe give John for a demo.
It's noted.
So here you can see, since we've been bantering a little bit and talking here, you can see the stored vMotions are running in the background, right? So the whole time these 10 have been restored. When these jobs finish, what you'll find is the average we see total start job to start finish. So if it was 60 VMs or 100 VMs, the total operation time is about a minute per VM. That's not a minute. That doesn't mean it takes 60 minutes for the virtual machine to be available. It's just for this entire job to actually finish running will take about 10 minutes, right? Because we're actually waiting for the storage vMotion to complete, if that makes sense. So yeah, if you've got 100 virtual machines, that backend process could just be chunking away, but they were all available within 5 minutes or less for us to actually interact with all 10 of them. Yeah, why are those rebooting? Who knows? I've got so much going on in this environment.
So Chris, actually, that's a good point too on the recovery process too. I mean, oftentimes maybe because everything comes back online so quickly too, sometimes maybe you want an order, but perhaps you don't even care what order just because it's going to be back so quick.
Yeah, some folks that get hit by ransomware, to be honest, their first priority is don't care the order, we just need them all back, right? So what we usually recommend for them is do the recovery, but don't power them on, so that they all come back into inventory side by side with the ones that were infected, right? So the other thing you got to remember is little nuances. If you say restore back to original location, it's a vSphere inventory. If you want it to have the same name as the previous one, you've either got to rename the new one in the inventory that you're restoring, or go in and rename the old ones as junk or infected or something, so that you can have them come in side by side, because they're going to come in and have the same IP address and all that other stuff. So these ones that went bad have to be shut down and renamed, most likely. So again, it's all process. In a ransomware infection, what we usually tell people is take all the infected ones, power them off, rename them to dash something old, use PowerShell to do that, use whatever you want. Then start your recovery process, bring all the new ones back in to original location, don't power them on, then selectively start powering on the ones you want to work on first. So you actually have most people in that environment, in that situation, want a little bit of manual control, because they don't want it all coming back at once anyway. And there is a point where I am a huge fan of automation, but I'm also a huge fan of sometimes the automation goes too fast and we may want to walk through it a little bit, because we're already down, right? So let's get back, but let's not get back up so fast that we create another problem.
Yeah, so I agree with that, because obviously quite often if you are powering on a lot of resources, it will take down the resources of the host as well.
Yes.
And especially in these scenarios, you need to make sure your foundation services are up first, like your DNS, like your AD and all that. Those needs to be up first. So you have to do it in a controlled fashion to get your foundation services online first, and then you can do the other next tier of critical service once you have your foundation in there.
And I think the ransomware discussion is the easiest, because if everything got infected or a number of virtual machines got infected, it's not a DR. It's not I guess there's a disaster, but it's not a environmental disaster like, hey, we had a tornado or we've got a hurricane coming, or earthquake or power outage. It was, yes, it's an unplanned, but everything's going to go back to the original location, right? So I always try to separate do we have to change locations? There's all these decision factors. Yeah. But I agree with you. If you can get it automated, so you can use PowerShell or some other tool to say, grab these 2 first, but that's assuming those 2 are infected or they're part of the infection stream,
and
right?
The another thing with ransomware Chris, is we don't know when it got infected.
Right.
Obviously, that's another unknown criteria. So it's a trial and error. We recover a week before maybe or a day before, but you could find out that it is a still infected copy. So that's another unknown factor which plays into picture as well.
Right. And there is something that we won't talk about today, but our Helios platform, if all these things are talking to Helios, we actually help with that. We actually will show data changes and present alerts that say, hey, the data change rate was significantly higher from backup job A to backup cycle B. Or when we index the VM, we can no longer index any files because they're encrypted. So we actually help you find that point in time, and we will actually present, Helios will actually present back to you. We think this is the best known good configuration and actually give you that as the backup or as the restore point.
Okay, so it give us an indication from the backup point of view where potentially ransomware might have gone in and encrypted our data.
It's not an end all.
That's a really cool thing to check, really, because obviously quite often people are lost when we got infected. That's the unknown usually. So that's really cool.
The trick to our stuff is the more often you're backing them up, the more data points we have, right? So I won't even get into this. So just before I get into that, so you can see this took about 12 minutes. Now, again, it's 12 minutes and 38 seconds for this whole job to finish. It wasn't 12 minutes before we could access the VMs, right? So that's kind of the key differentiator. And the storage vMotion piece is something we have to just kind of put aside. On that other note, what we find is because of the way we do backups. Now, if we run a full and then an incremental and they're low change rate VMs, we do have customers that have significantly changed their backup policy, meaning, hey, we used to back these VMs up every day. Then we got a new system and we started backing them up twice a day. Now they put in Cohesity and they're backing them up every couple of hours, right? Because our incrementals go so fast and use so little data that it gives them more data points. So to your point about ransomware, if we're only backing up once a day, it doesn't matter when it hit. If it hit yesterday or the day before or the day before that, and we didn't find it till 3 days later, we've got to go back 4 days. And we've got 4 days of loss where if a system like this can handle shrinking the backups, and actually, we've got very large customers that are now doing, in some cases on their high priority VMs, doing them hourly. So if they get hit, they can go back and say, hey, it wasn't yesterday, it was 3 hours ago. And we can just lose, we can go back 4 hours.
I guess with the network bandwidth and everything which we have these days, those days are gone when the backups only runs non-production hours. They can be running in the middle of the day anytime just to get those, because as you said, it's very small interval changes anyway. So it can happen anytime in the day as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and if we look at our protection runs on some of our stuff, and what people do is they'll split the jobs up, right? So if they know, it's part of why we use the tagging features or other features. Well, hey, we've got certain systems that are high data change rate. Those aren't going to back up every hour, and those may actually back up once a day and only happen overnight. But yeah, to your point, because we're streaming all that data, the more nodes you have, the more Cohesity nodes you have, the more data you can stream, which means you can pull it off the hosts faster if it's spread out across multiple ESX hosts. So we got customers backing up hundreds and thousands of virtual machines during the day, multiple times a day. The only considerations are, is there going to be a stun problem on a particular VM when we put it in snapshot mode? Typically that's not going to affect the performance of the majority of their VMs, but they're starting to look at their whole backup policy structure very differently to figure out how to combat and recover, especially in a ransomware attack. Because if they can do more backups more often and not, with our compression rates and dedupe and all that other stuff, storage isn't usually a problem. So the network is the next factor. Performance is the other factor of the VMs while they're running. But I think a lot of customers will sacrifice a little bit of performance to get more data points and points in time because they just don't know when they're going to get hit. I mean, I was just working on this the other day, like for you guys who use the vExpert store. I'm like, how do I back up that database like real time every time an order comes in, right? Because what happens if it has to be restored? Can't restore the orders. So it's small potatoes, but the use case is still the same.
Yeah. Makes sense. Thank you.
How are we looking on time, Patrick?
Yeah, you've got about 5 minutes or so, 7 minutes. So
Okay.
you've got
So we're
time
doing
to
good.
do some of the stuff still.
What I want to do is kind of open it up for some more questions because this is a great discussion. I don't want to hit anything more than what you've seen because there's so much more. Like that's why we want to give you guys a license to get in your labs because you can experiment with more of the sources, and you can see we've got Oracle adapters, we've got John testing botched archives. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in this cluster. This is this is our large sort of demo cluster that's physical, so we can do a lot more with it, and it's tied into Helios. But that'll leave a whole bunch more for Teresa to dive a little bit deeper in. So other questions in the last 4 or 5 minutes that we have, or something else you want to see from a high level? Or we can take the break early.
So I have one question about deduplication. What is the deduplication and compression rate?
Obviously, it varies a little bit. The percentage rates vary, but you'll get reports on it real time through the dashboards. So on this particular cluster, we're getting about 2.8 in reduction, and this number is way off because all this stuff was built from templates. So our storage reduction is very high. So this is Mike, we actually just figured out the difference between these two the other day. Because one's data, one's storage. This is data in. So our reduction on what we think we're ingesting. So this is the data ingestion rate. So we're ingesting about 2.8x reduction. This is what's sitting on storage. So we're only consuming 4.7, but
Chris, judging by the faces of everyone looking, slow down a sec as you're clicking back and forth, and I see people going.
Sorry. On this cluster on disk, we're getting a very high dedupe and compression rate because all the VMs we're backing up are various template builds. So it's almost like doing a VDI infrastructure in this lab because all the VMs are nearly the same. The system thinks it's pulling in 912 terabytes of logical data, but we're only storing on disk about 4.7. So that's always a variable question, right? How much are we getting?
So just to add to that, so one of the things that can add to that variable are images. So if you're dealing with customers in the healthcare space and they've got a large amount of images, you're not going to get the level of deduplication and compression that you would if it was just straight data. And then in terms of the straight data, I mean, our customers typically see significant reduction. But like Chris said, we don't make any commitments. POC is oftentimes the best way to look because every customer's data is so different.
So is there any recommendation for like hospitals, like healthcare, sector, like in terms of deduplication, or is it obviously just because they are images, they will consume more data, they can't get more deduplication out of them, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the SE team, honestly, I think the SE team is really good. If a customer's got good data points on, hey, we've got this amount of data that's images and videos, they've got some tools they can use to say, okay, well, we know those aren't going to compress. So, they have a scaling tool, a sizing tool, basically, that takes a lot of that input into account. But we actually leave a lot of that up to the SEs for the sizing. But yeah, they do have some spreadsheet tools and things like that.
And then go ahead.
Oh no, go for it. I've got a completely separate question.
Oh, so just one quick thing then I'll add to the healthcare question. So one of the other areas that we have some significant benefits with are those healthcare enterprises that are using Epic. We deal with the cache information in a very good way because we have a technology called Megafile that helps us deal with large files. So I just want to make sure you at least heard that before we moved on to the next question.
Mine's probably really simple. We've looked at restoring a whole VM, but what if I just want to grab a single file off that VM or a couple of files? I know everywhere seems to offer it these days, but I thought I'd better just check, better ask.
Yeah, we can do it. I'll definitely say use it in your, so if I go to files and folders, do it in your lab. the cool thing about this is the way we actually index. We take a virtual machine, we back up the VMDK, we open it, and we index the entire VM, all of the files on the VMDK on every single backup run.
That's more what I'm thinking. Numpty users, devs. Oh, I've deleted a file. Oh, well, I'm not restoring a whole bloody VM just for one file.
So here is, if I just do a star search, you know, you can see everything. If I want to look for, I don't even know if there's anything with .doc. It'll find everything, you know, that's been indexed with doc in the title. I'm trying to find something with PDF. I don't know that we have anything out there, but there we go. Readme.pdf. It'll tell you which group it was in. So we know that, because if it existed on multiple servers, we'll need to know which one that it was on. But you can actually pick by file or folder. You can browse by a specific path, but it's, every file is there. So you can, and the files, I think typically on the restore will just come right down to your, I think they'll come down to your local machine.
To go along with that, Chris, I think it would be one of the things we mentioned that you guys won't have access to Helios for the apps, but when you're looking at specific file-based, we have a couple of apps between either Spotlight or Insight that are both pretty neat on that. I think Spotlight, showing you if you're using us as a file server, will actually show audit log access, who's touched it, who's modified it, who's deleted it, and you can search by file or by person. Insight actually will go in and look at both the VMs as well as any files are running as file services, and you can search by something in the file. So often that dev says, oh, I did this, but I don't remember what the file name was called, but it was based on blah, 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 whatever it was. You could utilize Insight to go find any file that had that reference into it. Also comes in handy when you're having to deal with things like regulations and finding people's names and stuff like that within a file.
Yeah, hence why that's where the question was going to lead on to, like, you know, things like GDPR, stuff like that. You want to strip stuff out.
Yeah, that's those you would use those other utilities to find them. This is specifically, hey, user deleted something off of their desktop or off of the server in a particular folder. You could find that and just recover the file.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, the stuff Mike's talking about fit the GDPR environment of, hey, is there a social security number? Is there something we need to eradicate? That's a little bit different. This isn't looking at the data inside the INI file. This is just this particular tool is the index of the file. Then there's another tool that will actually go a level deeper and then look at the data in the PDF or in the Word doc or whatever.
That's cool. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, and those are Cohesity apps that are in the app marketplace. That, again, unfortunately, you guys don't have access to for demo purposes.
We do have some of those available through like YouTube demos, though.
Yeah, there's
some specific.
I think Insights might be, or Insight might be on right now. That if we need to, we may be able to show it even. But I know we're
in this lab, but they still can't access it because you have to have Helios.
Yeah, we can actually show it though.
Yeah, just as what Mike's talking about is when you do have a full cluster and you do have apps installed, this is where they're shown, but they have to be installed. They're sort of pushed from Helios, and then you install them and run them. So yeah, Insight and Spotlight are the two that Mike was referring to. So we actually have an active instance of each of those running, and they're running it as a containerized application. These were deployed in April, so they've been running for a while.
Yeah, I think they were the ones that I had up for demos, and I haven't turned them off because we haven't needed to turn them off.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I forgot about that, though. The whole IP address problem. That's being fixed. Cool. So that gives you kind of the high level for Teresa to go dive a little bit deeper after the break.
Yep. So the time now, it's just coming up to 20 past. So I think if everyone's all right with a 10-minute break, I think should be sufficient. 10, 15 minutes. We'll come back and we'll... So you can also hang on the Zoom and chat if you want or whatever. I'll pause recording and we'll start again in about 10, 15 minutes.
Awesome. Yeah. So knowing that this was kind of an EUC group, I actually took on the Citrix aspect of things. Not totally familiar with everyone's background So if someone could just kind of share, does this group know anything about XenApp, or was it primarily like VMware? Or I'm just trying to level set, so I know where we're at.
I'm mostly VMware, VDI.
Okay.
Horizon sort of person, yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, more VMware for me, but
okay. Is that maybe one more just to get consensus? Okay. All right. So we're gonna.
Citrix for years.
Okay. Well, cool. Then hopefully this will be informational for everybody. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about Citrix, some of the issues that I've seen enterprises run into over the years. We're going to talk a little bit about architecture, and then we'll dive into the Cohesity element with some demos. So with that, as most of you know, regardless of the platform, system failures happen, right? 80% of unplanned system outages are due to an administrator or developer change. Stuff happens, right? 60% of availability and performance errors are the result of misconfigurations. And the cost of a downtime to our enterprises, our customers, whichever hat you're wearing, can be very expensive. In fact, as much as $5,600 a minute. Of course, that can translate into any currency. So when systems fail, whether it's Citrix or any other platform, it's disruptive and expensive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the system failures that I've seen in the Citrix space. So first of all, Citrix licensing servers are a single point of failure. They've always done it that way. They've built in mechanisms that basically allow for grace periods. So like if your licensing server crashes, your users will get a prompt that says that you don't have a license, but it'll let you proceed. Or if you were already in the system when the license server crashed, the user won't know anything happened. So they do have some buffers from that perspective, but I have found that even a pop-up telling a user that they don't have a license and they can continue will send up red flags. And if there's a service desk, or if you're the sole person supporting that enterprise, you're going to get called. And so in my case, yes, people called. We had just done something as simple as applying Windows updates. System check went fine. The system came online fine. However, the license server services themselves would no longer function. So users calling in left and right, even though if they had just clicked through, they would have gotten to their application. So I think really the big thing that we learned there was that recovery could happen. We had a backup of the server, thankfully. But we did have to be able to get back to a point in time before the Windows updates had occurred to be able to move forward. And in this case, it was a legacy type system. So, this system was down for a couple hours just to be able to get it back. And service desk wasn't happy, users weren't happy, even though they could have still technically done their work. This is a very common issue in a Citrix environment. So when we get to the architecture section, I'll call this out a little bit further, but basically the backend architecture has these application servers or VDAs. And so where all of the user applications get installed and get launched from is what we're talking about here. So we get users calling in about a Citrix application that they couldn't connect to. Research indicates that this is the third time in the past 2 weeks that a certain VDA has had a problem. And so with the deployment that was in place at the time for this environment, you weren't actually relying heavily on backups. You were relying on having multiple copies or multiple installs of this VDA across several different servers. But that doesn't mean we didn't want that server back online. So in this case, there was a manual rebuild occurring because there was no real good way to get to an actual clean state. So because essentially, again, a legacy backup system, really having a backup to be able to recover to any point in time to meet any SLA would have been important here, because now this manual rebuild had to occur, which was a huge pain. I should also mention, because I'm going to go back to this, just one other thing, since there's not a lot of background in Citrix. Because users come in and out of these servers on a regular basis, it is not unusual for this to happen because of profile corruption, for example. Applications get corrupted, you're sharing printer drivers, and so many different factors play in here. VDAs get redeployed on a regular basis. And then in terms of storefront, another architectural element, storefront upgrade, in this case, corrupted the install. And I've had this happen across many different versions. Thankfully, in all these cases, I wasn't doing like a production test, right? I was deploying storefront to a new server and then upgrading one that was out of production. But it's happened to me more than once over the last 20 years. For whatever reason, storefront seems to have issues with upgrades. And so one of the things that I've learned is that even if the system's not in production, that checklist has to have backups in place right away, because if you do any update and you need to roll back, you may be rebuilding instead. So these are some of the real world issues that enterprises can have with Citrix. So now let's talk a little bit about some of the architecture. And actually, since I'm going to start with our environment and I'll go back to that enterprise one, just to kind of help fill out the story that I just shared. So Customer Zero is our tag environment. Chris and John actually worked quite hard to get this up and running, and have kept up with it over the years. They started working on this well before Mike or I ever started with Cohesity. But in the recent past here, I did deploy XenApp. And so of course there's an architectural element. So storefront, which we talked about in terms of the software upgrade issues that can occur, is actually the web front end for Citrix. So users are basically going to hit some form of a load balancer. Sometimes there's also a NetScaler involved where the load balancing happens there. Typically there's external access involved so that those user devices can come in, and you go through the storefront web front end. So it's a web portal. In terms of what we have for the rest of the architecture, if you step down a little bit there's a Citrix license server, an RDS license server, and there's a Citrix delivery controller. So we talked, if I go back to the license server element, we talked about the Citrix licensing server typically being a single deployment because there's other backend elements, but users have low tolerance for getting nuisance messages when this license server is not functioning correctly. So that is that particular element. The delivery controller that I mentioned is kind of the control element. So if I wanted to see user connections to the environment, if I wanted to do monitoring, I leverage Director. And then my databases, I use SQL Express for our Customer Zero environment. However, you can use SQL, full-on SQL databases for this as well. So that's kind of the second and third elements of the architecture. And then I also talked about the VDAs. I have 3 VDAs deployed to our environment. The VDAs are where all of the applications are installed. You typically do an N+1 deployment in a Citrix environment. So for example, on VDA 1 and VDA 2, if I had all of my Office applications installed, because I'm not using Office 365, for example, maybe I have Word, Excel, and PowerPoint installed on those, and I have 100 users, I'm probably going to be wanting to run that across 3, maybe even 4 VDAs. You're going to want an N+1. And in terms of how you figure out how many servers you want, you typically would do some application baselining, check CPU, check memory in terms of what load is placed when a user is doing work, and then you do those calculations. So in this case, I came to the need of 3. So that's probably one of the most simple types of environments you could run into. Now this, stepping backwards, is an environment that I had a huge part in deploying and architecting for a healthcare organization. So, and these, as you probably know, I think many of you are doing consulting. I mean, this is probably more mid-level to large than, some go even bigger. But we had a virtual environment. We needed to support 2,000 desktops for the healthcare staff. We expected 1,400 people on at any given time. We needed internal and external access, remote devices, mobile devices of all kinds. And we needed Citrix receiver deployed, and they wanted, even though they were virtual applications, they wanted the icons on the desktop. So this is what we deployed. And so we ended up with our license server. I'm not going to read off this whole list. I'll just let you kind of peruse it here. You'll notice the single license server. Everything else was deployed with at least some level of redundancy, and in many cases even the N+1, where you have more than 2. We were running Citrix on a VMware ESX hypervisor. We had 6 hosts as well. So real quick, I'm going to shift over and just kind of show you the environment, and then I'll take a break for any questions you might have. So similar to the other deployments I've dealt with, we did deploy this Citrix environment to our vSphere in the lab. And you can see on the left, I have several different servers that were part of the architecture. So I have my storefront servers. We are not load balancing them with any kind of NetScaler, because this is more of a, Customer Zero is more of a lab environment. We are just using DNS round robin for that. In terms of licensing, this RDS CLS is our RDS Cal and Citrix licensing server. My control box is this DDC, and then I have 3 application servers. And then I did bring some of these online. Perhaps the most interesting one would be the DDC, because that is where you control everything. So Citrix Studio is what you would use to manage your environment. And you can see anything from like desktop sessions to your applications. Actually, I'll come down into here. So in my environment in Customer Zero, we have 4 applications deployed. If someone's connected to those applications, it would appear in this list. And so this is a little bit of that back end. The front end of this, so what a user would see, this was logged in, but it might time out. Let me just cancel that. I have one virtual desktop deployed, and I am auto launching that. So that's why that came up. But basically, we have our admin desktop, which goes straight to the VDA desktop. You do have to lock that down with policy. That can be group policy. Likely it's going to be a combination of group policy and Citrix policy, and perhaps even a third-party tool, such as like a Liquidware, for example, to lock that down so users can't do anything with that. But we're using it as an admin desktop. And then there's other applications I have deployed as well. So that's a little bit of how that looks, and I'll just show you how, because I'm on a Mac, it prompts me. But we have our desktop, and then we're going to go ahead here, and we'll see calculator open. And calculator just came open. So I'll pause and see if there's any questions. I know that's probably like your 30. Your quick and dirty overview of Citrix architecture. So I just want to make sure there's not any questions.
Yeah, we have Vlad and Cedric join for just as we started that. So hi Vlad as well. Just thought I'd jump in quick and say that he's on as well. So carry on. Questions, peeps.
Sure.
I'm asking really silly
question.
Oh, go for it. No, you go first.
Yeah, my question is, why wouldn't they change the architecture to not have the licensed server as a single point of failure? After all these years, they still keep that like that.
I know. Well, it seems like there's some improvements in some of the newer versions with that, like the grace period on that, for example, lasts for 30 days. It used to not be that way. It was like you literally had less than a week to fix your Citrix license server. I think, I don't know. I personally, I think users don't tolerate that user message very well, but they have not changed it. So yeah, you just have to make sure you have great backups. And the other piece to that though, so that grace period, if this server was wiped off the face of the earth, any users that had previously been connected to Citrix before would be able to still get in with that nuisance prompt. You'd want to get it back online for new users as soon as possible. So.
Again, do you mind if I ask you a bit of an odd question about the kind of architecture on that one? Because I've done a few Citrix environments in the past. Yeah. You again, this is just seeing how you guys kind of tie into, where you can instantiate VMs in, say, AWS, Azure, things like that. Would you ever consider putting some global server, is it GLSBs they call it in Citrix, if I remember my training from years ago? Could you put any of those out there just to try and recover to other areas and speed up that recovery?
So that would probably, yeah, so most enterprises are going to use, like for the global load balancing that you're talking about to help with disasters and help with recoveries, you'd want to have NetScalers deployed to your environment. Mm-hmm. And absolutely, if there's a disaster recovery environment, so I came out of enterprise. I know I didn't talk about my background that much here, but just over a year and a half ago, and the Citrix deployment that I did there, we had a disaster recovery site with the GSLB load balancing in place so that if there was an actual issue, we could go off to our DR site and leverage that. Now, GSLB is not just limited to disaster recovery, right? But it does work as a really nice fail-safe. It's a really good question.
Yeah, it was just more just seeing the power of your product, just saying, we'll actually go throw all those desktops over in AWS or something like that. My site's completely on its backside, but I could instantly recover all those VMs really quickly and over there, if that makes some sense.
Yeah. And the other option too that you have today, so Citrix Cloud, for example, it's basically just simple licensing, and you can actually run all of your workloads in Azure. And so, and we haven't gotten to the Cohesity section, but even if you did like your VDA deployments, for example, you'd still need an RDS server. The license is covered by the license you purchased through Azure, the regular Citrix license, but you still need your RDS server. Storefront is built in with Citrix Cloud. Let's see, your DDC is also built in with Citrix Cloud. So if you did your deployment to Azure, you might even be able to, for example, leverage some of the cloud-based disaster recovery for some of those elements as well. If that makes sense. Any other questions? Okay, so then I'm gonna kind of shift gears into the Cohesity side of this. So I switched to dark mode for the preference at play here. And in terms of what Chris showed you in the first part of this presentation, I mean, essentially, this is just picking up where he left off, right? So this is our customer zero environment. We have sources registered, we have backup jobs running. And in my case, I have a specific job to Citrix where I have all of those servers that I showed you being protected. They run across multiple hosts. So when I set up this protection job, remember the question of tagging had come up, but when I set up this protection job, all I did was went in and typed in XenApp to be able to find all of my servers. So I didn't leverage any tagging to be able to do this, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is that like it's super easy, even if stuff is all over the place and you don't use tagging and you just leverage your server names, to be able to go out and protect what you want just through this simple search. And you also saw how quick that was as well. I mean, literally it popped up in not even seconds. So here we're protecting all of those servers. And then I went ahead, so that's my backup job name. I just leveraged one of the standard policies. Chris showed you how to do a custom policy, and he also showed you how to leverage an existing. So I went with the silver policy that backs up every 12 hours and keeps these for every 2 weeks. But you have the flexibility that you need to change this to whatever makes sense for your enterprise. And then this backup job is set to go out to next year. And outside of that, I mean, these are many of the standard things that you'll be playing around with and testing as you start working with the deployments in your labs. So this would all be the same. So long story short, I have a backup job, protection job, and it's completing. Okay. All right, so the next piece of my presentation, I don't know that we need to probably show you, but I'm just basically going to show you how the server recovery would work as it applies to what we could consider a production environment. I didn't pre-bake anything, but I will try to make this go as quickly as we can. So what I'm going to go ahead and start out with is one of those VDAs. The reason I want to do that, I'm going to head over to my DDC. If I go back and do that search, here, I don't even need to search. I do have a session on, it looks like VDA 3. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to take that server down, and we're going to, I think hypothetically we could say that in this particular case, one of the applications was corrupt, or we could even go back to Chris's example of ransomware, right? We have to take this system down and out of production to be able to recover it. We're just going to say something is wrong with it, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and go with VDA 3. And I'm going to just hard power it off. And in order to be able to do a restore, we're definitely going to also want to rename this. I suspect many of you use a similar approach. I know in the environments I've worked in, when something's been wrong, if I still have diagnostics that I need to run on it, not only will I take it down, I'll disconnect the network card on it as well so that I can bring it back online and do diagnosis and troubleshooting. I've actually had Citrix servers end up with malware of sorts and ransomware, but we didn't actually know what was wrong with it when we took it down. We just knew something was wrong. So taking that approach of disconnecting the network card and taking it down, renaming it so we could work with it later, have the security team analyze it, was extremely helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and just put my initials in the front of this for that rename process. So let's go back. There's often a delay. Let's go ahead and see if Citrix realizes that server's down yet. This is the piece that I probably won't necessarily want us to sit around and wait for, because in my experience, I've typically seen these take 10 minutes or better. So we may just end up doing the restore right away. And the reality is, if you were troubleshooting this in the enterprise, you wouldn't wait for Citrix to tell you it's down. If you know it's down and there's a problem, you're just going to start restoring anyways. So we're going to go ahead and take that approach. We know we have a session on a server that we have taken down. It's no longer online. So I'm going to go ahead and go to recoveries. And I'm going to recover a VM. And we want the down one. Yeah, VBA. Let's put a job instead. The job. Why is the down one not showing? Or why is only the down one showing? Let's go. We'll do a little troubleshooting. Let's make sure I actually have that one in the job like I thought I did. So I go to my Citrix job. And I go to edit. If I go to sign up. Because I was playing around with this yesterday. I may not have protected the new one. Well, let's go ahead and save that. And let's save. And let's go ahead and give it a run now. So because of how I set up that job manually and didn't let the detection process chop down, it required me to add that back, because I actually did this yesterday. This only took a few minutes yesterday, so we'll let that run. So one of the things that Chris showed you was how you could auto protect from the top down. I didn't use that approach for this job, and that's why I ended up in this situation. So I think it demonstrates why auto protect is a good approach. Are there any questions while we're waiting for this job? Well, the other piece to that then is going to be indexing. So I don't want to leave you guys hanging on the indexing either. So let's just pick on a different server, although I will pause for questions. Are there questions? Okay. So unfortunately, I don't have a connection to a server, so let's go ahead and go into receiver and let me launch another app. Let's see if we grab onto VDA 1 or 2, since I need that protection job to hit that. Okay, so I have a calculator job open. So let's go to the DDC and go to our applications. And let's go ahead and look at sessions for calculator. So it looks like we have an active session here on VDA2. So let's go ahead. I'm gonna just, there's no reason this shouldn't be in the job, but I don't want to go down the same path. Where did that job go? This, which is also almost done. We'll go ahead and just double check. Look at the machines. We have VDA2 is protected, so we are good. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and down this VDA. And I'm going to go ahead and rename it. Okay, and we'll go ahead and let's go into recoveries. And let's go ahead and recover the VM. And we have VDA2. And it looks like we have a job from this morning that I'm going to go ahead and just grab. And then we're going to go ahead and do this to the original location because I want this brought online as soon as possible because of the outage that my users are feeling at this point. I'm going to go ahead and be brave here, and I'm going to go ahead and start attached and connected. I'm going to let it come back as the original name. I'm going to power it on right away. I'm going to let it continue. I'm not going to let it continue on error. So if I do have something misconfigured here, or if there is an actual problem, it won't continue. So let's go ahead and start the recovery. Let's go check it out in vSphere here. And it's already bringing it online and relocating the virtual machine. So if you think about what Chris was telling you about our restore process and how we fully hydrate it and restore user access, I mean, this is online and ready to go. Users would be able to connect to it. All it's doing here on the back end now is working on that relocation. So of course, the amount of data you have on a machine will dictate how quickly this will restore, but typically our recovery processes are quite expedited. I do want to let this finish before we do head back into Citrix. So what questions can I answer?
Have you thought of any other ways of orchestrating this at all? With like monitoring solutions, like if you do see it down or anything like that?
Oh, so how do I know if my Citrix server is having issues?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are some ways. Most of what I've used are manually done. So for example, we didn't talk about this, but a common issue with Citrix VDAs specifically are that they need to be typically rebooted on some sort of interval to kind of refresh the memory and CPU. And so I have, well, at this point it's outdated, but I have scripted via PowerShell a way to check for uptime and then email it out to me and my team. So then we'd have someone in the morning checking that to see if there's any systems that need to be looked at. Because if it didn't reboot, it could potentially be hung. The other thing in terms of monitoring solutions that might be more proactive and not scripted, there are several. Well, there's actually quite a few that are really good in the Citrix space. So EG Innovations, Goliath, and ControlUp specifically would be really good tools to implement to help be more proactive as opposed to being reactive. Because it is hard, right, to be in that situation where all of a sudden you're fielding a bunch of calls because one Citrix server is misbehaving. So those are a couple different approaches that have proven to be successful.
That's cool. I was just curious in what you've used in the past. I was just more looking at what you guys are offering. As you say, you know, if it hasn't rebooted after 2 or 3 times, tap into your guys' API, rename the VM, restore it, and then if it doesn't work after the restore, panic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. I could almost see you leveraging more of a PowerShell automation to be able to do that, especially if you want to automate that check and then potentially even automate that restore, or at least be alerted, right? So you can go manually intervene. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that system is back online. Let's go ahead. I have a feeling this should in theory be disconnected, and you probably have noticed like my little Citrix icons have been hopping around here. Let's see what happens if I refresh. So that system being down did, as I would expect, interfere with my session. So let's see what I have down here. I'm curious. Okay, so it's been trying to reconnect. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. And then let's go ahead and reopen and see what it does. That's our desktop as well. Okay, so calculator's back open. Go ahead and do a refresh. Oh, and it reconnected to the one that we just restored. So it just shows you how simple and fast, like if you have a solution like Cohesity for your recoveries, how fast that can be back online. I can tell you, like I said, I just came out of enterprise not that long ago, less than 2 years ago. None of the legacy tools we were using for backup and recovery would have brought this server back that quickly. It would have been much more painful. So let's see, what do we have for time? So we do have a bit more time. I could do something similar, say for storefront or one of the other workloads. Unless there's other questions you have that we could take. Like we could also just leverage this for general Q&A. All right. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, see you, Eric.
Thank you very much for the presentations and demos.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so since we have a little more time and I'm not getting any questions, let's go ahead. Chris or Mike, let's kind of improv a little. Is there anything more deeply, like say on smart files or anything we'd want to go into?
I mean, do you guys want to see just a basic walkthrough of kind of with smart file? I think the smart file side of things, realistically, it's traditional file services. I mean, you've got your NFS, SMB, S3, and Swift access for unified access. A couple of things that are kind of interesting with it. One, the ability to integrate antivirus directly into your NAS solution. So I know historically, most of the time we end up pulling antivirus out, often doing it at the edge because of performance issues. We do tie antivirus directly into at the the file system level so that you don't have the performance impact. And then I think the other one that it kind of separates it really is the data migration. So if you have a traditional array, the data migration allows you to take your traditional NAS, whether in this point I think I've got Isilon and Windows box that it's been running against. You've got your original array that maybe you don't care about, you know that only about 2% of it's hot at any given time. Why keep spending all the money on that tier 0 array, that tier 0 NAS? What we'll do is push a stub out to it. We can point at that array, create the stubs on it, so it's a single access for the end user, but we'll migrate all of those older files, whether we say, you know what, I need everything that's over a gig and more than 6 months old, or more than 3 months old, whatever it is, to migrate off. It'll put that on a view or a file system on the Cohesity cluster, and then just leave that stub on the primary. So not something you see in most primary arrays nowadays. Then we can also do things once that data is on us, like using the insight that I mentioned. You can do data protection against it. You can do Spotlight to see who's been accessing what files, things like that. So you get a lot of the compliance boxes you can check off with that option as well on some of the data once you move it over. It also works great for a migration path for moving off of maybe an aging legacy NAS that you can just move off of it and present it. We can also utilize the data protection for that as well. If you had, say you were backing up a Isilon or a NetApp, we can just take that data protection job and then recover it as a Cohesity view. So when you do a recovery, you can recover as a view, allowing it to then just show up, and there's your migration. So no longer are you taking forever to do a forklift migration off of a NAS. Now just back the thing up and recover it as a NAS onto us, and you've migrated over. So
yeah, so I don't know what the group would like. I'm happy to still stick with like maybe doing another recovery demo showing a failure in Citrix, or we could maybe veer to like the NAS side if the group's used to it or interested in it.
Can I just ask one question about the NAS? I don't want to kind of steamroll it and take it away from the other guys, but more, can you then, once it's on your guys' storage, can you then tier that? I know you can do that with your backups, but what about the files? Like, for instance, if I say it's not been used for, say, a year, can I push that off to an S3 location or somewhere else or anything like that?
So you're thinking about data tiering specifically on the file services side of things?
Yeah.
Teresa, could you go to a view since you're sharing already anyway?
Yep.
So I know that might sound a really bizarre request, but it's like, well, you said
it's not.
It's not really.
No.
So go ahead and just edit one of them. That way we can kind of show some of the options of what is available on it. So you'll see that realistically you can do a lot of the things. As far as tiering it off, no, not today. What we can do are things like restrict what's on it, add in the dedupe compression that you see, but we don't have an option to tier that off today unless you were using the data migration side of it. In all reality, you could do the data migration against us as well and have it migrate to something. But what you could do also is create something out on maybe a cloud solution and replicate off to it as well. So it's not direct in the way you're asking. I get what you're asking for, and no, it's not direct to do that right now.
That's fine. Just exploring options. I know, for instance, one of our file servers is 6.5 terabytes big. It's ridiculous, but it's like, well, half that hasn't been touched. Some of it hasn't been touched for years. But as you said, could I get it away from the legacy storage, backing it up, then present it via this, and ship it off out the way, and put that project for another rainy day kind of thing?
Mike,
Yeah, I mean,
Mike, I guess a good takeaway is I'm going to admit this. I know how Cloud Tier works from a backup side of things. I don't know if we've actually integrated Cloud Tier into Smart Files because it's still a cold tiering mechanism, but it does it during the backup process right now. Like it'll move the data, the old cold backup data, but I don't know if it'll move cold Smart File data.
Not as far as I'm aware. It won't right now. So it's something we can bring up on it. Realistically, I think part of the reason it's not there yet is we tend to be the second tier for files. that you're moving that to us as a second tier, not moving some of it off of us to something else. We just haven't been. We'll say our file side hasn't been there that long, so most of the time we're already starting as the second tier, not the first tier. But we are starting to see more and more of us being the first tier. So it's a good question. But right now it's not integrated into it.
It's more just one of the things we're trying to move away from a legacy environment, possibly have a brand new greenfield thing, and then have some form of appliances backing it all up, new and old. And then it's like, well, how do we, one way of doing an exit strategy of all of our file servers, just back it up, and then can we tear it off somewhere and it's just another little feather in the cap?
I think the data migration element could be useful here.
Yeah.
If you left those files, if you left your file shares and that data as your primary storage, we could take the old data through data migration, and then that could then be stored on that Cohesity. Like Mike was saying, we would act as that second tier as it sits today.
Okay.
I think the other big differentiator for us here, and Mike, I don't know if this is where you were going to go next, but we actually, if you do choose to store files on us as the primary, or if you create a view to be the secondary, you can connect to our views through all of these protocols if you would like, which is actually very unique in the industry. Typically it's one of these, right?
Yeah, it's more like just like the whole thing that we could store certain stuff via SMB, but then some of our other apps could then pick up as S3 is actually quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Teresa, can you go to data migration for me for a minute?
Absolutely.
And edit one of the jobs. I'm trying to remember if something's there or not, or whether the challenge is always when we're dealing with futures on some stuff, remembering what's actually here and what they're working on before I give you an answer on something.
No, that's fine. I know it's just a really old question. It was just as I start playing with some of my labs, start thinking of future use cases as well.
Do a show advanced. Okay.
Mike, what are you looking for?
I think I recall something that we're essentially doing, that we can do a data migration and select that the target that we're going to is not necessarily a view on us, but into an S3 mount. But it might have been something they were working on and we're not there yet.
I think so.
Yeah, I think
not in this release. It might not be there yet.
I think our big takeaway here is to go investigate Cloud Tier, because Cloud Tier is a file system level function. You turn it on at the cluster file system level. It's not a job-based function like the other cloud components. So I'm separating it in my mind. So I can do a cloud archive as part of a backup policy, right? So during the backup job, I back it up, I index it, then I archive it, right? Cloud Tier.
You're talking about the external targets?
I'm talking, yeah, but Cloud Tier is not a job-based configuration. It's a file system-based configuration. You either turn Cloud Tier off on the file system or turn it on. And once it's turned on, you can't turn it off. So, Mike, where I'm going with this is logically, since it's at the file system level and it's supposed to move cold data, we just need to ask, is view data part of the cold data that is automatically tiered out? If so, we've actually answered the question. Then Cloud Tier is how we actually migrate cold data behind the scenes. Because and that's where I'm separating it. It's because it's a file system. It's a cluster level config, not a job level option.
Yeah, you're right.
It's a global thing.
Maybe that's
it wouldn't make sense for it not to work on smart.
I think this came up in one of my recent analyst discussions, and I had to think this through. And I think it might have been it. Was we were like, oh yeah, I could do it, but it would do it at the entire cluster level. Then, not just for a specific view.
Yes. Yeah, it's the entire file system. You turn tier on, and that's why you can't turn it off, because once you've turned it on, if we move something out there, we don't really give visibility into what's been tiered out cold and what's been kept on. So you can't just go in and turn the option off.
Well, thanks.
Gives us something to go back on.
Gareth, I took a note. Anything else you guys want to see on it while we've got a system up that's running? I know We wanted to make sure you guys all had access to it. You should have all got access to both all the Slack channel as well as to be able to get the community licensed version down and put it in your environments wherever. But are there pieces you might want to see? Potentially, I think the only thing we can show you that you won't be able to see on yours is, Teresa, maybe let's go to Helios and show maybe some of the dashboards in Helios. Since they won't be able to see Helios, at least they can see it now.
I don't know if I have, do I have an individual login for Helios?
Yeah, Chris had to create all of them for us because they were, remember, they're under the Cohesity Rocks though. They're your Cohesity Rocks account.
All right.
Can I ask a really silly question? I know I get shouted at by my line manager when I probably connect this up to our AWS account, but as an example, could I restore from my lab into AWS quite happily with the Community Edition just to show that off? Or does that require Helios?
No, that doesn't require Helios. You can actually play with the Cloud Spin function.
Okay.
So that would actually be a Cloud Spin capability where you actually take something from the catalog, right, that we've said is pick any one of them, and then you can spin it up to AWS or Azure. I will say the AWS one's a little bit longer of a process because the main difference is when you spin to AWS, all we're doing is changing the VMDK header. So the longest part of the process is uploading it to Azure. Then we flip the header and then we mount it as a VM. On the AWS side, you have to use the AWS tools. So the first thing we have to do is put it in, copy it to an S3 bucket, then run the AWS APIs to convert it out of the S3 bucket over to an EBS volume and then mount it. So the overall AWS process is just a little bit longer.
That's fine.
Because of the AWS tools. But no, it's going to be called Cloud Spin. Okay. Once you get your access, you have access to all of the documentation and KBs and all that other stuff in the support site. So you literally actually have access to everything on the support site other than opening a ticket with support. we actually did a lot of work to prevent that, mostly because we just the support team didn't want to start getting called. We're like, the Slack channel is where you'll get support from one of us, basically.
I would just think it's some cool blog post, and that would just be quite a good one, just spinning my lab out into one of the clouds.
Yeah, and if you do that, let us know, or at least tag Cohesity, because they'll, the socials team will amplify it or something, so you'll get some more views on it. But yeah, that would be a Cloud Spin. There's also an incremental Cloud Spin capability where we actually, and you have to watch some of this because it creates copies on AWS, so your static costs are going to go up because you're going to be creating more copies of it. I wouldn't play with that one. Play with the one-time Cloud Spin just to say, hey, take this VM and spin it to AWS, and then you can actually see it come up. Obviously, there's no runbook component for that as far as changing network. So the DNS, stuff like that will have to be manually done, but it does move the data and convert it to an AMI.
Cool.
It's pretty cool, actually. We've demoed that at a couple of Cloud Field Days, and that's a big one that we expected people to play with. Office 365, both SharePoint and Exchange online. So if you've got access to those, you can actually, once you connect to your O365 environment, you can back up, once you connect to Office 365 through the APIs, you can back up Exchange and SharePoint. It's considered one source in the product. So it's not like, oh, I have Exchange online, then I have SharePoint. Like, no, you just connect to Office 365. There's some other stuff coming down the line for the SaaS stuff, but it'll be like SFDC and other things you guys probably don't want to really connect to because they're bigger SaaS apps.
I'm going to bore the other guys now, but how do you guys play with Teams? I know technically SharePoint and OneDrive, but have you guys cracked that yet?
Not yet.
No, that's fine.
It's being developed.
It's fine. I don't think anyone really has.
Yeah, it's definitely coming, but we're still working out the timing and what it's going to look like.
Trying to remind my users, if it's important, stick it in SharePoint. If you leave it in Teams, well, whoops.
So just to give you guys kind of a quick walkthrough of the Helios parts that you want to see, mainly it's some dashboards on it that you're just not going to be able to get access to right now. On that, starting with the summary is going to look the same, whether you're on the all cluster or on an individual cluster one. It's pretty similar. That should look very similar to what you've seen already today. Data protection on it, it does give you a nice little topology to see what's going on. You can see if there's something that's out doing something differently for it. And then obviously mouse over to D if there's what objects are there, errors, anything that's going on with it. File services, the same file services here. I can see a lot. It's nice to see I can see by protocol as well as different file types. So if you've got specific ones, you know that all of a sudden you're using a whole lot more of audio files than what you were before. You can get that idea right away. But then cloud being, when it comes out, what your consumption is out in the cloud, what's expected on it, and then also by provider. So if all of a sudden you're looking at it and you get a bill and you're like, well, why am I using that much? It's nice to be able to see it. The one that I think gets probably used the most out here is going to be the security one. Now it's got two options on it, either for anti-ransomware. This is the anomaly detection that Chris was talking about. If we see an anomaly that pops up, if there's been some occurrence, obviously our map doesn't show as much because everything is coming out of one location. So all of our systems look like they're just sitting in California.
And Mike, can you zoom in on that? It's barely readable. I don't know which monitor you're on. No, like the whole browser window.
Oh, sorry. I forgot a little big screen on it. Yeah.
Actually, the map thing is come up a couple of times with customers. Interestingly, the way we read it is we read it based on, I'm trying to remember, I think it's GeoIP. And because all of our stuff is in the same data center, it all shows like one big red dot. There was actually a customer that requested an actual field. Can they put an address in of where that cluster is so that it would actually populate on the map? It sounds silly, but a lot of customers have said, why is everything one big red dot? That's all. Or because they've got, more importantly, most customers have a distributed architecture. Their internet connectivity routes back through the spoke. So they, they've got all their branch offices, but all their branch office routing is routed to the main office when the internet goes from there. So even though they're in branch offices, it looks like they're all in the same office here. So it sounds silly, but that came up once to have an actual address with geolocation. That's the situation we're in. Everything runs through the same data center for internet.
If I had something that we found was hit by ransomware, I can select it right there.
Yeah, don't do that one.
I'm not going to do it.
That's my NSX manager. Don't mess with that.
Actually going to do
Ibrahim's like, no, don't do that one.
I'm not actually going to do it. Here, I'll pick one of the Zen apples. Feel better?
So actually that brings up, I want to ask you guys that how many, so vSphere 7, which we don't have installed yet, there's everybody actually, we have friends at Veeam, right? I'm really good friends with Michael and Anthony and those guys. They're in the same boat that we are. When vSphere 7 came out, you all read the new note that says that you basically can't back up a vCenter appliance with tools like ours and Veeam and others, right? You have to use the built-in backup, which uses an FTP model or an SFTP model. We haven't tested it with 7. I know Anthony did with their product, and he said restored fine. So we're trying to figure out like how VMware is actually blocking that backup capability on the vCenter server, because it's just a VM in the inventory, but we haven't gotten clarification yet.
We're actually on time now, but if no one's got to rush away, I still need to do. We can carry on with this for a bit, and
I'm just showing random stuff so people can see that.
I think
all right.
vCenter 7 backup is more to do with the HA setup, which we can do eventually by setting up a vCenter HA, and that becomes a problem because you have RD replication going on with 2 vCenters and all that. But yeah, I guess obviously, if we are having a single vCenter, we could potentially do the traditional way how we just do a VM level backup. It should work.
Yeah, I saw Roger just put in there, and I figured it had to do with the internal database, Roger, and with replication. But it's just funny they put it in the release notes that it will no longer be supported for VM level backup, but only on that appliance. So
yeah, I don't think they want to support it. Right?
I think so too, because we've actually done demos where we've taken a virtual center, and it's to your point of the database, like we've nuked the virtual center and restored it, but we've been backing it up like every hour or something, so we have a lot of backups. And then what we've seen when we've done the tests is if VMs were added in that hour, they just show up in discovered VMs, right? They get repopulated, but they did lose their original database ID. because it would have gotten brought in as a discovered VM versus having been put in the inventory. So I can see how there's some challenges, but it's actually prompted us to have an application running on the platform that actually supplies. You'll notice SFTP is not a protocol that's currently supported. It's S3, NFS, and SMB. So we're actually working on creating a way for SFTP to be a protocol into the file system so that you can do those dumps. And I hate to call them that, but they're kind of like a dump of the system.
Yeah,
NSX Manager does it the same way.
It'd be interesting. There's a lot of Cisco products that like to back up with that method as well.
It's not just VMware. So it started coming up with vSphere 7, but all the other products. So expect to see an SFTP protocol show up in one of the releases at some point. So you will be able to actually use this as a backup target for NSX Manager, vSphere, VCSA, all that other stuff. So we get that question a lot because now people look at it and they're like, "Where's SFTP on the protocol list?"
And nobody cared about it for a long time.
No, yeah, nobody gave a shit till 3 months ago.
I'd also be curious to see what it would be like to try to just back up the vCenter database independently.
Yeah, I don't want to mess with that. If you want to try it in your lab, go for it.
Okay, so we're at time on this. So obviously, I don't know whether anyone's got to jump onto anything else. I'm sure you guys do at some point. I've got the giveaway that we usually do at the end of this. So I'm going to share my screen and I'll share my screen now. I'm going to share screen. Yes, okay. So I'm assuming you all can see my screen now. We're going to give away one of these secret labs again.
I can't see your screen.
You can't. Oh, that's really helpful, isn't it? Share screen.
Remember that whole end user error comment earlier?
Yeah. Thank you for that.
You're like the brother I never had.
This is, you know what? This is my problem with Macs. Okay, this Mac gives me no. Next time.
I like how you keep blaming the Mac.
Blaming the Mac. Yeah, I don't understand that.
Okay, look, here we go. I'm host, aren't I? Yeah, share screen.
To be fair, I just think that Teams broke me. I couldn't share any of my screens. I was like, this is useless.
All right, well, okay, I'm going to have to just do the random and you're going to have to trust me on this because it's not letting me share it. It just comes up with exclamation mark on every option. All right, that's annoying. Okay, I'm going to do it. Spinning wheel. That's helpful. It's in between Chris and Eric. Let's use. Oh, okay.
What are you giving away? I don't even know.
Secret lab chair.
Oh,
they're pretty good. Or if you can't get it in the US, something equivalent.
Apparently, we agreed to that, Chris. I didn't remember either.
Yeah. Okay.
I've got it in an email. Don't worry.
Must have been to you, Mike.
It's all good. Hold on. I'll try again.
Should we tell Eric now that he must be present to win?
Yeah. It's him again. Is it sharing my screen now?
No.
No. Just give the thing away. Everyone trusts you that you're randomizing it by now.
Yeah, I know. But every time it keeps landing between Eric and Chris, this thing's useless. Right, okay, hold on a sec.
Eric isn't present, so.
All right, well.
Give it to Chris.
All right, then. Fine. Okay, well done, Chris.
Wait, so I won?
No. Yeah, no. Not you, Chris Bradshaw.
Oh, you lucky man, Chris.
Excellent. Thank you.
Congrats, Chris.
Thought my back.
Congratulations.
Yep. So we will do that. I think they've sold out of the XLs right now. So you either have, if you want one of those, you have to wait. Otherwise, the normal ones I think they've got on pre-order at the moment.
Cool.
Congratulations.
So yeah, well, I'll sort that out with you anyway. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming again. I will get the video uploaded and sent out to you guys. As always, if any of you feel that you would like to write about the experience here and just, give us a bit of a plug about, Cohesity, what they're doing, and also, the vRetreat events, that will be much appreciated. Help us continue to deliver more stuff like this. And yeah, thank you very much. I don't know, Cohesity, Mike, Teresa, Chris, if you've got anything else to say to end the evening or afternoon rather.
No, I'm good. Appreciate it.
I would just say thanks to everyone for coming, and if you have any questions as you're working through stuff, just let us know.
Cool. Well, thanks for your time, guys.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. No
Guys, looking
worries.
forward to questions and comments.
Yeah, just put them in the Slack channel. You guys should all get access to that, hopefully. If Mike did everything right.
I got an okay that everyone's was supposed to be.
There we go. He didn't do a Patrick.
Okay, guys.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Cheers.
All
Cool,
right, thanks
thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.